This episode is sponsored by The Vanished, a podcast that tells the stories of often overlooked and unsolved missing persons cases. Follow The Vanished on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, or listen early and ad-free by joining Wondery Plus in Apple Podcasts or the Wondery app. Thank you, and enjoy the show. September 29th, 1984. Chicago, Illinois. 23-month-old Deborah Sanders is taken from her mother, Norell Sanders, who claims she was violently attacked by the child's estranged father, Odell Sheppard, before Deborah was abducted. Nearly 1 year later, Odell is tracked down and arrested, but he no longer has Deborah with him and maintains that he returned her to Norell. After serving a prison sentence for child abduction, Odell winds up being sent to jail for contempt of court after refusing to produce Deborah. Odell remains incarcerated for over 10 years before he is released, but he never reveals what happened to Deborah, whose whereabouts remain unknown. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be exploring a truly tragic case involving a missing toddler, the 1984 disappearance of 23-month-old Deborah Sanders. So obviously, cold cases involving missing children who are that young are incredibly heartbreaking, but if there's ever a potential silver lining, it's the possibility that the child might still be alive somewhere under a false identity, completely unaware of who they are. In many of these cases, infants and toddlers are stolen by people who either want to sell them on the black market or raise the child as their own. But this particular story is quite a bit different and wound up going in an unusual direction. At the time of her disappearance, Deborah Sanders was being raised by her mother, Norell Sanders, until a domestic dispute took place, which led to her being abducted by her father, Odell Sheppard. Norell and Odell never married and were no longer living together, but because they had never gone to court to establish who actually had legal custody of Deborah, the laws on the books at the time made it unclear if Odell had actually committed a crime. Since Deborah was a child who hailed from a low-income African-American family, her disappearance got no media coverage at all for years, but the case eventually received mainstream attention when it wound up making legal history. By the time Odell was arrested, he no longer had Deborah in his possession, and maintained that he gave the child back to Norell, who was now intentionally hiding her in order to get him into trouble. After serving a prison sentence for child abduction, Odell was ordered to produce Deborah, and when he refused to do so, he was held in contempt of court. And believe it or not, this led to Odell spending the next 10 years in a county jail without even being charged with a crime or put on trial. Needless to say, this caused quite a bit of controversy because regardless of what he may have done, there was concern that Odell's constitutional rights were being violated. Odell was told that he would not get out of jail until he revealed Deborah's whereabouts, but he was eventually released without actually doing so, and Deborah is still missing to this day. I remember coming across this case nearly 8 years ago when I featured it in an article I published for listverse.com titled 10 Haunting Unsolved Child Abductions Committed by Parents. The whole situation has always bothered me because even though Deborah has been missing for 4 decades, I'm not even sure anyone is actively looking for her anymore. I don't think I would classify this as the most mysterious case I've ever covered on The Trail Went Cold, but I definitely think that Deborah's story should be profiled to ensure she is not forgotten. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or a review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the disappearance of Deborah Sanders. Our story begins in Chicago in 1984. Our victim is a 23-month-old toddler named Deborah Sanders, who is just 3 weeks shy of her second birthday. Deborah is currently being cared for by a 32-year-old mother, Norell Sanders, who also has an older 14-year-old daughter named Hope from a previous relationship. Deborah's father is 36-year-old Odell Sheppard, whom Norell became romantically involved with over 2 years earlier, though they never officially married. Odell and Norell have since become estranged and are no longer living together, though Odell still occasionally visits their daughter. However, on September the 29th, Norell called the police from her apartment on South Ada Street in order to report the abduction of her child. According to Norell, earlier that day, Odell had phoned her up and threatened her, claiming that he was going to take Deborah away and she would never see her again. Well, sure enough, Odell soon showed up at Norell's apartment, and Norell claimed that he struck her several times before literally grabbing Deborah from her arms and fleeing the scene. Odell subsequently phoned Norell again and told her that he was not going to return Deborah, and that if Norell tried to contact the authorities, the next time she would see her would be in a quote-unquote pine box. Despite Odell's threats, Norell did contact the police, but they were initially reluctant to take action. From a legal standpoint, the situation was complicated because Norell and Odell had never officially married or gone to court to work out their custodial rights for Deborah. At the time, the law was unclear about what exactly Norell's custodial rights were, as unwed fathers who had not established paternity could not be charged with child abduction unless the mother had previously been awarded custody in court proceedings. In spite of this, the police did agree to launch an investigation, but it wasn't long before Odell phoned up Norell again, threatening to kill both her and Deborah because he found out the police were questioning his family. A few weeks later, on October the 18th, Norell received another phone call from Odell, and this time, he allowed her to speak with Deborah on the phone, though this would turn out to be the last time she ever heard from her daughter. At the end of October, Odell phoned Norell again to inform her that he had abandoned Deborah in Arkansas or Memphis, Tennessee. Well, it turned out that sometime before this call took place, Odell's mother and sister, as well as his current girlfriend, had reported seeing Deborah inside Odell's car while he was attending a family member's funeral in Memphis. In November, Norell received one final phone call from Odell. This time, he offered to return Deborah in exchange for $2,000 in cash, but since Norell was on public aid at the time, she told Odell that she did not have that kind of money. Deborah would continue to remain missing for nearly an entire year, but in July of 1985, Odell was finally tracked down in Tennessee and arrested. He no longer had Deborah with him, but denied all allegations that he had abducted the child. Instead, he claimed that he had made an arrangement with Norell to take Deborah to visit relatives in Tennessee for a few months before he returned to Norell's apartment and gave Deborah back to her sometime in December of 1984. Of course, Norell completely denied this, and numerous eyewitnesses, including Norell's other daughter Hope and Norell's cousin, would maintain that they were at Norell's apartment almost every day since Deborah was first taken and never saw the child there at any point. This claim was backed up by multiple investigators who worked on the case, as they made numerous visits to Norell's apartment and said that they never saw Deborah or any evidence that a child her age was living there. Indeed, it did not appear there were any confirmed sightings of Deborah since she was seen with Odell at the family funeral in Memphis in October of 1984. There was a lot of concern that Odell might have harmed Deborah, since he had allegedly told Norell she would see her daughter in a pine box, but Odell denied ever making that statement. Following Deborah's disappearance, Norell had gone to court in order to officially obtain full custody of her daughter. By the time Odell was tracked down, the laws had been amended in order to make it easier for unwed mothers to prosecute fathers for child abduction, so Odell can now be charged with that offense, as well as aggravated kidnapping. 1 year later, Odell went on trial for these charges and selected a bench trial instead of a jury trial so that a judge would render the verdict. On September the 18th, 1986, the judge ruled that since Odell was Deborah's father, he could not be convicted of aggravated kidnapping, but he still found him guilty of child abduction, making Odell the first person in Illinois to ever be convicted under the amended law. He received the maximum sentence of 3 years and was sent to the Stateville Correctional Center. On October the 6th, 1987, Odell was paroled after serving less than half his sentence, but would immediately find himself facing some new legal trouble. While Odell was incarcerated, Norell had filed an ex parte petition seeking both emergency and plenary protection orders against him under the Illinois Domestic Violence Act, as she alleged that Odell had phoned her from prison and threatened to harm her following his release. Under Section 214b(7) of the Act, Norell also demanded that Odell produce Deborah. Odell was served with a summons informing him that Cook County Circuit Court Judge Martin Brodkin had awarded temporary custody of Deborah to Norell, so Odell was ordered to produce the child within 3 days of his release from prison. On October the 9th, Odell appeared without legal counsel at a hearing in Cook County Circuit Court, but he did not have Deborah with him and would not reveal her whereabouts. As a result, Judge Brodkin held Odell in contempt of court. An evidentiary hearing was held on November the 19th, in which Norell and a number of other witnesses testified about the circumstances of Deborah's disappearance. When Odell took the stand to testify on his own behalf, he continued to stick to his original story that he returned Deborah to Norell in December of 1984 and had no idea where the child was. He accused Norell of being vindictive and deliberately hiding Deborah with friends of hers in order to cause legal problems for him. By contrast, Norell accused Odell of intentionally refusing to disclose Deborah's whereabouts because he wanted to make her suffer. While Judge Brodkin did not believe Odell's version of events, and once again found him in criminal contempt of court before he was sentenced to 6 months in the Cook County Jail. Brodkin told Odell that if he produced Deborah, he would vacate the rest of his sentence and allow him to be released, but if he did not, Odell would receive an additional 6 months once his sentence came to an end. While this was taking place, the Illinois State Police handled the investigation into Deborah's disappearance as part of their I-Search program. They offered a $2,500 reward for information on Deborah's whereabouts and circulated age-enhanced composite sketches of her to school districts throughout the state, but they failed to turn up any leads. When Odell's 6-month jail sentence came to an end in May of 1988, another hearing was held in which Odell continued to maintain his innocence and did not reveal Deborah's whereabouts. Judge Brodkin gave him another 6-month sentence for contempt, and when Odell still refused to talk at a hearing which was held in November of that year, he received yet another 6-month sentence. The maximum number of consecutive sentences that the court was allowed to impose for criminal contempt without the defendant receiving a jury trial was 3, but even after serving 3 6-month sentences, Odell still will not talk. So at a hearing in May of 1989, Judge Brodkin gave Odell an open-ended civil contempt sentence, meaning that the court had no obligation to release him from jail until he did what was asked of him. Brodkin stated, quote, "I'm not sentencing him at all. He's sentencing himself. He can purge himself anytime he wants to by telling us where the girl is," end quote. Odell will continue to remain in the Cook County Jail for the next several years, and when a new Cook County Associate Judge named Marjan Staniak succeeded Brodkin, he continued to uphold the original ruling. Things reached the point where the case wound up making legal history as it became apparent that Odell was serving the longest recorded sentence for contempt of court in the history of the United States. This caused the case to receive nationwide publicity and generate a lot of controversy. Some attorneys and legal scholars believed that even if Odell was withholding the truth about what happened to Deborah, holding him in jail for contempt for such a long period of time without charging him with a crime or allowing him to go on trial was an overreach and abuse of judicial authority and a violation of Odell's constitutional rights. In 1994, Odell's attorneys even took the case to the Illinois Appellate Court and the Illinois Supreme Court in order to ask for his release, but both courts upheld the original ruling. In one of the opinions, Justice Benjamin Miller wrote that the defendant, quote-unquote, holds in his own pocket the key to his jail cell, and he may win his release at any time by complying with the order of the court. According to Norell Sanders' attorney, Joan Colin, quote, "Every time we've gone back to court and gotten an order that he will be returned to jail, I felt that surge of elation. Yeah, I've won. And then I feel an incredible feeling of defeat because this is not winning at all. I don't know if it will ever end." End quote. Well, on January the 24th, 1994, the situation finally did come to an end when Norell passed away at the age of 45. There are differing accounts from different sources about whether she died of a stroke or kidney failure, but it was believed that the anxiety of not knowing where her daughter was contributed to Norell's health issues and caused her premature demise. In addition to her eldest daughter, Hope, Norell had gone on to have 2 more children following Deborah's disappearance. During one interview, Norell stated that she had told her children, quote, "I said, if something happens to me and I die, do not give your sister up. If you have children, tell them to look. I want someone to know what happened to her." End quote. At the time of her death, Norell said that she only had one remaining baby photo of Deborah because the others had been destroyed in a fire. Norell's death had an impact on Odell's incarceration because it had always been her responsibility to renew the original orders of protection against him every 2 years. Since Norell never turned that responsibility over to anyone else before she passed away, the civil contempt of court order was rendered invalid. So 4 days after Norell's death, Judge Staniak held a hearing in which he conceded that the contempt order was not working since Odell never wavered from his original story. Staniak stated, quote, "He has refused until this moment to say where Deborah Sanders is. I am very sad that we still don't know what happened to her. The death of Miss Sanders is what is terminating the proceedings. I hope the police will continue to look for Deborah." End quote. As a result, Staniak agreed to release Odell from jail after he had served a record-breaking 10 years and 3 months for contempt. Odell continued to remain silent about what happened to Deborah, though some of her relatives held out hope that Odell may have abandoned or sold his daughter and that she was still alive somewhere. However, there has not been any activity on Deborah's social security number since she originally vanished, and fearing that she was no longer alive, investigators made the decision to close the case. So after 38 years, Deborah Sanders' whereabouts continue to remain unknown. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, we would like to take a few moments to make mention of The Vanished, a podcast that tells the stories of often overlooked and unsolved missing persons cases. As you can tell by this particular episode, The Trail Went Cold has also been interested in showcasing lesser-known missing persons cases, but no other show does this quite as well as The Vanished, as each week, host Marissa Jones dives into a new mysterious disappearance, which is laid out through interviews with law enforcement, friends and family of the missing victims, and sometimes even suspects. It's all in an effort to get to the bottom of the truth, and The Vanished is aided in some of their featured cases being solved, as well as getting long overdue arrests through their in-depth interviews. I've known Marissa Jones for years, and even met her a few times at podcasting events, and she started The Vanished around the same time I started The Trail Went Cold in early 2016. Back then, there weren't that many true crime podcasts around, and Marissa felt that our show would be a good opportunity to showcase some lesser-known missing persons cases, which often didn't get a lot of exposure. But over time, The Vanished evolved from a podcast into a full-fledged public service, which has helped a lot of families and been a valuable resource for law enforcement. It has done a deep dive on many cases that were completely unknown and had not received any media coverage at all until they were featured on the show. At the time of this recording, The Vanished has been around for nearly 7 years and produced over 360 episodes, so I can't recommend it enough. It's a podcast which has not only shared important stories about missing victims, but has helped change lives for the better. Follow The Vanished on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, or listen early and ad-free by joining Wondery Plus in Apple Podcasts or the Wondery app. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of this episode. So sometimes, I'll feature a cold case on this podcast in which there really isn't much of a mystery per se, but I still believe it needs attention. And sometimes, the most unlikely cases will wind up making legal history, which is exactly what happened here. There are also a lot of complicated ethical issues surrounding this story, because even though it involves a defendant who is hardly a sympathetic figure, there was still some question about whether his constitutional rights were violated. What we do know for certain is that a 23-month-old child went missing and has not been seen for 4 decades, and there are really only 2 explanations for what might have happened. Either Odell Sheppard stole Deborah Sanders from her mother Norell and continually refused to reveal the child's whereabouts, or, if you believe Odell's version of events, Norell willingly handed Deborah over to Odell, and even though he gave their daughter back to her a few months later, Norell continued to keep Deborah hidden for an extended period of time in order to cause Odell legal problems and ensure he would remain incarcerated in jail. Well, I think it goes without saying that no one believed Odell's version, as not a shred of evidence was found to indicate that Norell was intentionally hiding their child just to spite him. There's no way Norell would be able to keep up a charade like that for over 10 years, and why would anyone else continue to keep hiding Deborah after Norell passed away and Odell was released from jail? If she was still alive today, Deborah would now be a 40-year-old adult, so why not come forward? What's the point in staying hidden just to spite someone who's been a free man for nearly 25 years? I guess my one big uncertainty about this whole situation is that it sounds like the case was closed by law enforcement following Norell's death, which seems ridiculous since we still have a missing child who has never been found. I guess there's a small chance that investigators uncovered evidence that Deborah was still alive somewhere and have not disclosed this information for privacy reasons, but I find that highly unlikely. It's also possible that they found conclusive evidence that Deborah is dead, but if so, why not charge Odell with murder? I don't have any information about what happened to Odell following his release from jail, but if he is still alive today, he would currently be 74 years old. Even though Norell passed away, Deborah has siblings who are presumably still searching for answers about what happened to her, so I just don't see the logic of closing the case. Is there anyone out there who is still looking for this poor missing child? Anyway, from my research, it does not appear that this case got any coverage in the media at all during the first 3 years Deborah was missing. This may have had something to do with the fact that Deborah was a young black child being raised by a single mother on welfare, but due to the laws on the books at the time, there was some initial uncertainty about whether Odell's actions even constituted a crime. I mean, yes, that seems pretty ridiculous in retrospect, considering that Norell claimed that Odell physically assaulted her and literally stole Deborah from her arms. I know there was some confusion about whether this constituted kidnapping, since Odell was the child's father and he and Norell were never married, so neither of them technically had full legal custody at that time. But I think that striking a woman and stealing a child from her arms would technically count as breaking the law, and we haven't even mentioned all the times that Odell allegedly threatened to harm Norell and Deborah over the phone. That part of the story is particularly frustrating because if the police had been on the ball from the very start, they might have been able to put a tap on Norell's phone to record the calls and possibly even trace where they originated from. Odell always maintained that he had permission from Norell to take Deborah for a few months and denied ever making any threats, which included telling Norell that she was going to see her daughter in a quote-unquote pine box. If these calls had been recorded by law enforcement, there would have been conclusive evidence to debunk Odell's story, and he may have even shared some information during the calls that could have provided hints about Deborah's whereabouts. But without recorded evidence, it was technically a case of he said, she said in regards to what actually transpired. The first media coverage I could find about this case was from the Chicago Tribune in October of 1987, which is when the whole situation started to become incredibly unique. This is when Odell was paroled after serving his sentence for child abduction, but was summoned to appear in court in order to produce Deborah or else be sent to jail for contempt. I think everyone was hoping that this would eventually cause Odell to break and reveal the full truth about what happened, but I'm sure no one envisioned that this whole saga would drag on for over 10 years. Of course, by the mid-1990s, this case became a much larger mainstream story because of the ethical controversy about keeping Odell in jail indefinitely for civil contempt without actually charging him with a crime or giving him the opportunity to go on trial. On one hand, it's tough to feel much sympathy for Odell since he was refusing to talk about the whereabouts of a missing child whom he may very well have murdered. But on the other hand, What if there was a small chance that Odell was telling the truth and legitimately had no idea where Deborah was? Some legal scholars do not hesitate to express how uncomfortable they were about the whole situation, as they believe that keeping defendants locked up indefinitely without trial, even if they were guilty of a crime, was the type of thing you would expect to find in third world countries rather than the United States. It was reported at the time that civil contempt was most often used in situations such as forcing reluctant witnesses to testify in front of a grand jury in organized crime cases. And regardless of whether the defendant testified or not, their contempt charge would usually expire and they would be set free once the grand jury proceedings came to an end. However, it was not uncommon for contempt issues to also arise in domestic disputes and family custody cases. This story was compared to another high-profile custody dispute which took place in Washington, D.C. during that time period and involved a woman named Elizabeth Morgan. Elizabeth had gone through a heated divorce with her ex-husband, Eric Fortich, and they fought for custody over their daughter Hillary. But in August of 1987, Elizabeth was jailed on civil contempt charges because she refused to produce Hillary for court-ordered visits with her father and would not reveal her whereabouts. Now, unlike Odell Sheppard, Elizabeth never denied knowing where her daughter was, as she instead accused Eric of sexually abusing Hillary and claimed that she was only hiding the child because she feared for her well-being. Eric always denied these allegations, and to this day, it's never been conclusively proven if any abuse took place, but regardless, Elizabeth wound up spending a total of 759 days in jail. She wound up getting released through an act of Congress when President George H.W. Bush signed a bill called the District of Columbia Civil Contempt Imprisonment Limitation Act, which was designed to limit incarceration for civil contempt of court in district child custody cases. The court believed that keeping Elizabeth in jail would never change her mind and compel her to reveal her daughter's whereabouts, so she was set free. It would turn out that Elizabeth's parents had taken Hillary to New Zealand in order to hide her, and Elizabeth would soon join them there. Now, you can understand why a more sympathetic narrative was built up around Elizabeth Morgan than Odell Sheppard, as she portrayed herself as a mother who was attempting to protect her daughter from abuse, whereas Odell presented a very unbelievable story that Norell was intentionally hiding Deborah as some sort of spiteful revenge against him. Norell always insisted that the opposite was true, as she believed Odell was intentionally withholding the truth about Deborah in order to torment her and prolong the agony of not knowing where her daughter was. And while Elizabeth's 2 years in jail might have seemed like an extreme sentence for civil contempt of court, I don't think anyone envisioned that Odell's sentence would completely dwarf that, and he would set a new record for the longest sentence ever served on a contempt charge in the history of the United States. In case you're wondering, Odell's record has since been broken by a guy named H. Beatty Chadwick, who allegedly hid $2.5 million in overseas bank accounts in order to avoid paying it to his wife as part of their divorce settlement. In 1995, a judge in Delaware County Court in Pennsylvania held Chadwick in civil contempt of court and ruled that he would remain incarcerated in jail until he turned over the money. Well, Chadwick always maintained that he no longer had the money because he lost it during bad investments, and even though he was never actually convicted of a crime, Chadwick would spend the next 14 years behind bars until another judge finally ordered his release in July of 2009. I have no idea if Chadwick was actually telling the truth about not having the money, but I would say this situation had far less urgency than refusing to disclose the whereabouts of a missing child. It's a major tragedy that Norell Sanders passed away at the age of 45, but sadly, it's not uncommon to see parents of missing and murdered children die at a young age, since the stress of the whole situation can have a major impact on their health. But if Norell had not died, it makes me wonder just how long this whole ordeal would have dragged on. Remember, since Norell filed the original protection orders, which paved the way for Odell being held in contempt of court, those orders were rendered null and void when she passed away, which is why he got released from jail. Since the higher courts kept upholding the ruling to hold Odell in contempt indefinitely, I would have been curious to see if he eventually cracked and revealed the truth once he realized there was no chance anyone was going to let him out. The whole situation seems particularly cruel for Norell, since she always believed that Odell was withholding the truth in order to torment her, and it seems like the torment got so strong that it ended her life, and Odell got to go on living his own life without any further consequences for himself. Since no trace of Deborah has ever been found, even after Odell was released, this only begs the question, did he kill the child, or could he have sold or abandoned her instead? Well, even though Deborah's loved ones did acknowledge that there was a good chance she was dead, they always held out hope that she might still be alive and in someone's care somewhere. And given her young age at the time she was abducted, Deborah could have been living under a false identity and had no idea she was a missing child and that people were looking for her. We do know that Deborah was alive for at least a few weeks after Odell took her, as Norell spoke to her on the phone on at least one occasion, and she was seen with Odell at a funeral in Memphis. Odell did tell Norell that he would give the child back if she paid him $2,000, but this was during a phone call which took place 1 month after the fact, so I'm not sure if extortion was Odell's main motive for taking her in the first place. And it's also worth noting that Odell made this extortion call after he told Norell he had abandoned Deborah, so who knows if he even still had her at that point. Since Odell had threatened the lives of both Norell and Deborah on the phone multiple times, it sounds like the abduction was just a cruel, narcissistic act intended to torment Norell, but since Odell did have Deborah in his custody for a few weeks, I'm not sure if he always intended on harming her. If Odell really wanted to raise his daughter on his own, he probably could have gotten away with it for a while, since the legal situation involving parental custody was a bit murky at that time, and it sounds like Odell was living in another state without anyone in law enforcement actively looking for him. But by the time Odell was found in July of 1985, he no longer had Deborah with him, so it was clear that he had reached the point where he considered the child to be a burden. Many sources state that the last time Deborah was confirmed to be alive was when she was seen at the funeral in Memphis, but I have seen reports that there were apparently sightings of Odell and Deborah together in New Orleans sometime after this. The November 20th, 1987 edition of the Chicago Tribune also stated that Deborah had been seen in December of 1984, when Odell's girlfriend at the time said that Odell brought his daughter to her apartment on the south side of Chicago. I haven't seen this information corroborated anywhere else, so I'm not sure how accurate it is, but it is interesting how Odell's story has always been that he returned to Chicago and gave Deborah back to Norell in December of 1984. So perhaps he really was in Chicago during that time period, only he got rid of Deborah by giving her to someone else there. However, as much as I'd like to remain optimistic that Deborah is still alive somewhere, the big issue with believing that is that if Odell had sold or given Deborah away, would he really have been willing to remain in jail for 10 years in order to avoid admitting that? I mean, yes, he does seem like the type of guy who would refuse to keep silent about Deborah's whereabouts in order to torture her mother, but I have a hard time believing he would be willing to sacrifice his freedom and stay behind bars for that long, especially since he was told numerous times that once he told the truth, he would be set free. Therefore, it's reasonable to assume that the truth was horrible enough that it would have caused Odell to remain locked up for the rest of his life. To make a comparison to a similar case which took place in Michigan and has been in the news these past several years, let's briefly discuss the 2010 disappearances of brothers Alexander, Andrew, and Tanner Skelton, who were all abducted by their non-custodial father, John Skelton, following a heated custody battle between their parents. John would soon be found in a hospital after a failed suicide attempt, and by this point, the boys were no longer with him. John gave conflicting stories about giving his sons away, and since no trace of the three boys could be found, everyone feared the worst. After agreeing to a plea deal in which he would plead no contest to 3 counts of false imprisonment, John received a sentence of 10 to 15 years in prison. He remains incarcerated to this day and refuses to reveal the truth about what happened to his sons, but the consensus seems to be that he likely murdered them and disposed of their bodies. Of course, it's not hard to figure out why John would stay silent about this, because he is scheduled to walk out of prison within the next few years once he finishes serving his sentence. But if he confesses to murder, he'll obviously never get out. And I think the same logic applies to Odell Sheppard. He likely found himself in a catch-22 situation because unlike John Skelton, Odell did not have a scheduled release date, so he had no idea if he was ever getting out of jail. But if the alternative was confessing to the murder of his daughter, then this guaranteed he would remain locked up. So Odell's only strategy was to wait out the clock and hope that someone would finally make the decision to release him, and sadly, this came about after Norell passed away. And unless police were able to find Deborah's body or any other evidence implicating Odell, he has every reason to continue keeping his mouth shut. So yes, it seems pretty obvious that Odell Sheppard got away with murder, and since he was not found for nearly a year after he originally abducted Deborah, there was no direct evidence of foul play. Odell and Deborah also apparently traveled through multiple states during this time period, so even if the authorities wanted to attempt a new search for her, where would they start looking? Unfortunately, it does seem like all the legal and ethical issues over keeping Odell in jail all these years became the centerpiece of this story, and while these issues are definitely worth discussing, it almost sounds like Deborah herself got overlooked. And since it seems like the investigation was closed following Norell's death, it appears that Deborah is still being overlooked. However, I would like to think that if law enforcement received some compelling new leads, they might be compelled to reopen the case. We know that Deborah was alive and in Odell's custody for at least a few weeks following her abduction, so perhaps someone saw or heard something important during that time period. I certainly do not want this child to be forgotten, so if anyone out there knows something, it would be nice if they came forward. So if you happen to have any information about the unsolved disappearance of Deborah Sanders, please contact the Illinois State Police at 847-294-4400. That's 847-294-4400. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. This past month, I released a special Halloween-themed bonus episode about the infamous Falcon Lake incident, where a man named Stephen Michalak supposedly came across a UFO inside a provincial park in Manitoba, which caused him to receive some unexplained burns on his body. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and my two co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, cover yet another case from Unsolved Mysteries, the 1991 murder of Soo-Ya Kim. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listener who has signed up with us on Patreon this week, and that's Jenna JL, so thank you so much for your support. Anyway, I'm also pleased to announce that I have officially signed to make my return to CrimeCon UK next year, as the world's #1 true crime event is returning to London on June the 10th and 11th of 2023. It's the ultimate true crime weekend partnered by CBS Reality, the expert-led true crime channel. It's your opportunity to get inside the minds of serial killers and psychopaths, learn from leading criminologists, hear from families and survivors, and immerse yourself in forensic evidence and delve deeper into unsolved crimes. And of course, it's also a great opportunity to meet your favorite true crime podcasters and creators, including The Trail Went Cold, in the event's content creators area. Tickets are on sale now, so in order to join us and get a special 10% discount, please visit crimecon.co.uk and use the special promo code COLD23. That's crimecon.co.uk, and the promo code is COLD23. Hope to see you there. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the ear music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. So have yourselves a good week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.